Yesterday we said that the two main events for Monday was the cursing of the fig tree and then the cleansing of the temple. And we said that really it's not the cleansing of the temple. That's really kind of misleading, because if you hear the word cleansing, you think that, okay, Jesus is just kind of removing some things, he's tidying things up of the temple. But what he did yesterday was literally he cleared out the temple. He said that through the connection with the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple, his plan is to completely remove the temple, to really make his body, his presence, the very temple where we can meet God. And so he does all this, and you can imagine now the tensions are rising. The religious leaders, especially people who are overseeing the temple, they don't like this. And so in verse 27 of chapter 11, once again, Jesus comes again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him. So notice that they recognize Jesus. He's on the blacklist. And so they asked the question, verse 28, "By what authority are you doing these things, or who gave you this authority to do them?" In other words, Jesus, he's doing all this activity. He's teaching also, he's cleansing the temple, he's clearing things out, and the religious leaders, they don't understand this, because they feel like it's their job to maintain the temple, to make decisions, and for Jesus to kind of remove all of that, it was a direct attack against their authority. And so they go into this gigantic conversation about Jesus' authority. And so what's going to happen in these next few chapters in Mark, and if you go to Matthew, it's more extensive. Jesus is going to tell 5 parables. He's going to answer 4 questions. And all this is related to his authority, who Jesus is. Because the religious leaders, they not only want to question Jesus, but they want to remove Jesus. They want to destroy Jesus. They believe that Jesus is a threat to their position, to their comfort, to all that they have built in this temple. And so now they're challenging Jesus. But I think the parable that is key in this passage is found in chapter 12, the parable that we just read, the parable of the tenants. And so we see that Jesus begins with this parable in order to really answer the question, why is Jesus acting with such authority? He says in chapter 12, verse 1, "And he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a pit for the winepress and built a tower and leased it to the tenants and went into another country." So notice that you have a man who loves his vineyard. He loves it because he's the one who planted it, the Bible says. He's the one who put a fence around it. You put fences around things that you cherish and you want to protect. It also says he built a tower there. So basically, this man built the vineyard from scratch. Like this is his baby. This is his work, and he, for some reason, leases it. He gives it to some workers, and it says in verse 2, "When the season came, he sent a servant to the tenants to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard." So after building this vineyard, this owner of the vineyard, he leases it, and then he goes away. And we don't know exactly where he goes, but it seems like he's far away. But one thing he does is, when season comes, he comes and basically comes to collect rent. And the way that people paid rent, especially when it comes to a vineyard, it wasn't that they had a monthly rent that they had to pay. They would be good stewards for that season. And when it was harvest season, they would receive the crops or the fruits or whatever was produced in the vineyard. They would pay a portion of that to the owner, and then they can maintain the vineyard for themselves. And so you have this relationship where you have an owner, you have tenants who are under rent, and so it's quite standard even for us, right? It makes sense that if you lease a home, if you rent a home, that you pay dues for your owner. And then it says in verse 3, though, when the owner sent a servant to collect, notice it says in verse 2, some fruit. So it's not even like an incredible amount. It's not that the owner is asking for a whole lot. All he was asking was for some fruit. And then it says in verse 3, "And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed." I don't know about you, but I don't want to try that with my landlord. I've been renting for quite a bit ever since I came to Virginia, I think for 8 years, and I want to maintain the best relationship with my landlord. You pay rent on time, you make sure that the things are taken care of. When someone comes to collect rent, and if it's the right amount, then you pay them. But it says in verse 3 that this servant, instead of paying the rent, they took him, beat him, and sent him away empty-handed. Now again, it says in verse 2 that this was this harvest season, when the season came. So it's not like in the middle of a season when there was nothing else. Like, it's not like the owner was putting pressure on these tenants. Clearly, these tenants had stuff to pay. Like, they had plentiful. Like, they had the vineyard and the fruits from the vineyard, which they could have used. And yet, for some reason, they don't want to pay back the owner. They feel like they did all the hard work. They feel like they're the ones who labored. And so they just basically beat up this servant. And you would imagine the owner being so upset at this. But notice it says in verse 4, the owner is so patient. He sends another person, but this time the activity increases, the violence increases. It says they struck him on the head and treated him shamefully. This time it's not just physical abuse, but emotional abuse, right? So why are they acting in such a way? It says in verse 5, and so with many others, and some they beat, and some they even killed. So these people are actively refusing to pay back the owner. They're rejecting the servants, the messengers of the owner. Like those who come representing the owner, telling them to pay the rent. And these people are absolutely bluntly rejecting it. And for the last resort, in verse 6, this is what the owner said. And he still had one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, they will respect my son. This son, he looks like me. He represents my authority. They probably are aware of him. Like, when we made that agreement, they probably saw my son, my kids. And so I'm sure maybe there's some misunderstanding. Maybe, the servants, they didn't communicate well. I know I can trust my son. My son, I'll send in my authority to my property, to receive what is absolutely due to me. And so the beloved son, notice the language here, by the way. It's not just any son. It's the beloved son that is sent to the tenants. But it says in verse 7, and this is where you kind of begin to see the heart of these tenants. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. And instead of being afraid, they say, come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. Now, you would think that if the son comes, okay, the owner really means business, and so you would pay back the owner. But I think what they were thinking is, we don't really know what happened to this owner. Could it be that the owner is dead? He's not coming himself? Like, we did this much damage, like we killed servant after servant, we destroyed all these messengers, and yet for some reason the owner is not showing up. And then now the son appeared, and could it be that maybe the owner is sick? Is he getting old? Is he not coming back? Could it be that if we just get rid of this one last son, that this place can be ours? I think that's the logic that they have right now. That's the thought process that they're going through. In other words, they are trying to take over this vineyard. They're not just happy just having stuff from this vineyard. They want to have ownership over this vineyard. So it says in verse 9, and Jesus now asked the question, hearing all this, what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. So throughout this story, the owner has been so patient, has been so merciful, but there comes a moment, a time where that mercy will end. That the owner will run out of patience. That the owner has to do what is actually right and just, something that he should have done from the very beginning, which is to remove these tenants, to judge these tenants, and then to give his blessing to someone else. And Maybe this might sound like a random story, but if you read it through the context of Passion Week, it makes perfect sense. How Jesus is communicating to the religious leaders that this is exactly what you're doing. It says in Isaiah 5:7, and that's a wonderful passage that talks about Israel being the vineyard of the Lord, the host and house of Israel. And so quite often in the Old Testament, Israel was portrayed as a vineyard, God's people. But at the same time, we see through this parable that Israel was given a place, given this prosperity, and given this blessing, not simply to just have their way with the place and God's blessing, but so that they would use it for His glory, and so that they would honor Him and thank Him throughout the process. And it's funny because in verse 12, it sounds like even the religious leaders, they knew that Jesus was speaking against Him, it says. It says, and they were seeking to arrest Him, but feared the people, for they perceived that He had told the parable against them. And so they left Him and went away. So the parable is absolutely clear. What God is saying, first of all, is this. We often forget, and it's not just these religious leaders, but we often forget that what we have in our lives is actually not ours, it's the Lord's. What we have, everything that we have, it really belongs to the Lord. Well, Psalm 24:1 says this, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness therefore, the world and those who dwell in it. Job 1:21 says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Jesus is not only the author of all things, it says in Colossians 1, but He's the sustainer of all things. Everything belongs to Jesus. And you have all these references that talk about the Lord owns everything. What we have is simply, for temporary, for a time, temporarily, we have things that God has given us. We saw the triumphal entry of Jesus on Sunday, and I think one thing that was always fascinating to me was how Jesus can take someone else's donkey so easily, right? If you ever think about that. Like, what Jesus does is he tells His two disciples, go into this other village, and if you see a donkey, a colt, and a colt that is young enough that never had anyone ride on it, you should untie it and bring it. The fact that it's tied tells you that this is not a wild donkey. It has an owner, that it belongs to someone. And yet Jesus says, just bring it. And if someone asks, you should answer, the Lord needs it. And surprisingly, when the disciples actually go and find this donkey and untie it, and people ask, most likely the owners of that donkey, they ask, well, why are you taking my donkey? And they say, well, the Lord needs it. They say, okay, you take it. How is that possible? Well, if we think about it, if we think that donkey simply belongs to those people, yes, that's a crime. But if we recognize that everything in this world really truly belongs to the Lord, what they're doing is they're not just giving Jesus their donkey, they're returning the donkey that they had for a few years. A lot of times we struggle to understand why God will tell the Israelites to judge the Canaanites, to conquer the promised land, right? That's a really key question that especially non-believers, they would ask, how can God be just when He's kicking out these people, peaceful people living in the land of Canaan, especially when the people of Israel, they're like, why can't He just lead the people of Israel to an empty land? Why does it have to be a place that it's inhabited by other people? But if you use this principle, just think about this. Does that land belong to the Canaanites, or does that land belong to the Lord? It belongs to the Lord. Like, you clearly see that God was the one who gave that land to the Canaanites, but what did the Canaanites do with that land? They didn't honor God. They didn't worship God. They sacrificed things not to God, but to other idols. They even sacrificed their own children. And so you have all this wickedness, corruption, evil taking place. And what God says is, I had enough. And so God takes the people of Israel and uses them so that He would judge the people in that land. And you might think, okay, God is just kind of showing favoritism to remove these and removing these people. No, I don't think that's really the case. Why? Because God was also willing to remove Israel when they were unwilling to worship him. He was willing to use even evil nations. In other words, God is the owner of all things. You see that in a donkey, you see that in a land, and you see that in today's passage, where the religious leaders, they believed that they had the right over the temple, that they had the right to do whatever they wanted to do, to run the temple. And what Jesus reminds them is that, although you guys are stewards of this place, you're acting as owners right now. And you don't even recognize the Son that came in the Father's name. Like, God has sent prophet after prophet after prophet after prophet after prophet. And what's really happening is, it's not that you're not recognizing what's going on. You simply don't want the Son because you don't want to let go of what you actually have. So in this story, notice that we often forget, no, actually we always forget, that really our life, everything that we have in this life belongs to the Lord, but the Lord is so patient and merciful. I think the reason why we really struggle to understand Christianity is because God is way too merciful. That he should have judged evil and wickedness way earlier in our understanding. But the reason why God allows evil and wickedness to still dwell in this world is because he is patient and he is merciful. Some people ask the question, well, why doesn't God just get rid of all evil right now at this very moment? That would be such a great thing. Well, the answer would be this, especially a lot of people who don't believe in Jesus might ask that question. The reason why I don't believe in Christianity is because there's so much evil around us. And what I think Jesus would say to that, I think how Jesus would answer that question is this. Well, if God got rid of all the evil, then what else would he get rid of? Evil people, right? A lot of times when we ask that question, we're assuming that I'm not evil, but things around us are evil, and therefore I want God to get rid of all evil. And what Jesus is saying is this, man, if God does that before people come to the cross, like, you don't recognize that it's not just the evil around you that's going to get destroyed, that you're going to get destroyed. So God is patient, God is merciful. This is why it says in 2 Peter chapter 3, God is not slow to accomplishing his will. He's just patient towards evil people. But one day, just like the days of Noah, the end will come. And God will bring justice. His patience will come to an end. And so the Bible reminds us that this is it. It says in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, long ago, at many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, sending messenger after messenger after messenger. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed, the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. And so God, he's saying that this is it. There's no other messenger. There's no greater sign. Jesus is actually it. And so if you reject the Son, God will have to reject you. But if you embrace the Son, God will forgive you. I think that's the promise here. It all boils down to how you treat the Son, how you honor the Son, and how you trust in the Son. My question to you this morning is there in any way in your life, anything that you're holding on to or in any area of your life, you're acting as if you are the owner of those stuff rather than being a steward of God's grace? Are you abusing the situation that you have for your comfort, for your success, for your goodness, rather than giving God the glory that he deserves? In any way, are we living as if, this life is just it, and that we should try to build a life around all that we see? God is reminding us that there is a true owner in this world, and that is Jesus Christ, that he is the one who should be hailed, and he is the one who all things belong to. And the good thing about our owner is that he is so gracious and patient that he's not just trying to take things away from us, but if you see at the book of Revelation, at the end, he's willing to share his inheritance with us. that he's inviting us to enjoy the things that rightfully belongs to him. And so instead of trying to hold on to things as if you can hold on to it forever, why not give it to the Lord and trust the Lord? Say, if the Lord needs it, I'm willing to give it. Allow God to work in your life and work in your heart so that you wouldn't reject the Son, but accept the Son. Now, some of you might say, I already accepted Jesus Christ. Whew, that's good for me. And you might made that initial decision to accept Jesus, but maybe on a daily basis that you're rejecting Jesus in a way that you're ignoring his word, ignoring the way that he's wanting to shape and mold your life. You're rejecting him in a way where you're living in disobedience. And so I don't think we have to live in fear, especially because that's why Jesus came. He never expected us to be perfect. He became a perfect sacrifice, knowing that we aren't perfect. But at the same time, if we know that the Son came and that we ought to accept the Son, and he is our only hope, then we ought to accept the Son on a daily basis and honor him in everything that I do. And so today, instead of rejecting Jesus, let's embrace him. Let's thank him for being so patient and so kind, and see how he has all the answers to our questions. Everything that these religious leaders, the authorities try to do, basically they don't work, and so at the end, they just walk away because there's no fault in Jesus. There's no uncertainty in Jesus. In Jesus, there's always light and clarity. So embrace Jesus and praise Jesus. Amen? Let's pray together.